Hi, guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. We're looking at a topic today which I've written about in my line of work and presented papers on. It's a very important topic as far as I'm concerned, that's grown even more important as the days have passed. Why are cities getting attacked so frequently these days? Most of the major security attacks on countries these days are in cities. If you took up a list of the major terror attacks in Western Europe or the United States, for instance, you will see that cities have been the major target. Or if you even look at large scale military engagements like in Syria and Iraq, you will once again see that the majority of the violence is clustered in cities like Baghdad and Mosul. Let's consider the backdrop. If you look at the world over the last decade or so, for the first time in recorded human history, the urban population is higher than the rural population. As in, more of the global population lives in cities today than they did in villages ever before. We need to realize that this is a very drastic paradigm shift from the way people chose to organize themselves and live their lives in previous generations, because previously more people have always lived in the villages, not in the cities. For as far back as we can tell, humanity was largely a rural population. Even if you look at the great kingdoms of antiquity, they might have had a handful of big cities which were known for their splendor and bustling markets and universities and buildings and all that, but the majority of the population would still be living out in the countryside, beyond the city walls. That has all changed these days, as I've been saying. Obviously, most of the problems and most of the violence that arises from humanity will be where most of the people live. If you look at armed revolts against governments in the 20th century, for instance, in the last century, they happened out in the villages. And while there were exceptions like Ireland and Algeria, most insurrections, most terrorist campaigns, most insurgencies, blah, 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 all originated in the villages in the 20th century, and the cities comparatively did not see as much violence. You just need to run down a list of all the armed insurgencies that happened in the 20th century, and you will see this for yourself. And you can also see, if you did the same thing for the 21st century, that the data is completely different. It shifted more towards the cities. So, why are cities such juicy targets for people wanting to plan an attack? I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list. I'm just going to pick out what I consider to be the four most important reasons for this phenomenon. Firstly, you tend to get very dense populations in cities, and therefore the chance of you being able to hurt a lot of people increases. If you attack a sports stadium or a shopping mall or a city square, for instance, you're likely to end up killing a lot of people, because cities by their nature tend to be quite crowded, even congested. Of course, there are small cities and all that, but I'm talking about the general trend. Most cities are densely packed. Certainly the most prominent ones in the world are. A single attack could lead to hundreds of deaths, which would be difficult to replicate in rural areas. A lone gunman in Paris could kill a lot more people in France in one night than an entire gang in the kind of rural hills in France. Second, the attention that attacks on cities get, particularly in the media. One of the big obstacles faced by Marxist insurgent groups in the 70s and 80s was that they barely got any international attention. And one of the reasons for this is that the media outlets, even in their own countries, didn't really care what happened in the countryside. The cities, on the other hand, are where the rich and affluent live. Anything you can do in a city will get you a lot of attention, which means increased exposure for you, more notoriety, a bigger impact for your cause, blah, blah, blah. If you look at a country like India, for example, there were hundreds of terror attacks against India even in the 90s, but there was hardly any media attention. There was, of course, media attention given in the national press, but the international media would often be quiet about it. But when the 26/11 attacks happened in Mumbai in 2008, The national and the international media were all over it because of the economic and cultural prominence of the place and how much the elite cared about that city. Third, cities also tend to be very cosmopolitan, which means that if you happen to be an ethnic or racial group or a group that's trying to create ethnic or racial divides, it makes it easier for you to destabilize the place. Cities tend to be far more multicultural and diverse than villages, which means there's a lot more social tension there for you to exploit if you can manage to divide the people. So if a group belonging to a particular religious ideology perpetrate an attack on a city, it would be far more likely to have long lasting and destructive social consequences for that country, because it would make people who live side by side hate each other and be suspicious of one another. Fourth, cities are actually really easy to destroy. Most of us who live in cities have no idea how fragile our lives really are. The food we pick up at supermarkets, the petrol we pump into our cars, the electricity we take for granted, the water we waste instead of conserving. All these things depend on massive logistical operations to get into the city. People are bringing all these things into the city. Villages are a lot more self-sufficient and resilient because they tend to be a lot simpler, and they tend to be able to fend for themselves because the nature of a village itself dictates that you're not as interconnected and interdependent as a city would be, and therefore your lives are not centered around these extremely complicated supply chains. Cities, on the other hand, are like these creatures that need to be fed constantly, and if we sort of refuse to feed them even for a few days, it just starves to death. So if you live in a city, keep that in mind. Everything from the food you eat to the water you drink is being brought to you by this giant system, and any glitch in the system could result in you getting none of that, which makes it all the more vulnerable to terror attacks and to violence, large scale violence in general. So those are my four primary reasons for why cities have started coming under attack, particularly by terrorist groups and things like that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on a subject like this, regardless of whether you live in a city or a village, right? So tell me what you think in the comments below. And as always, if you like content like this, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you, take care, and I'll see you soon.